Popeye the Sailor.
Welcome to the premiere episode of the Cartoon Curator. On this episode, I will delve into the history of one of the greatest and iconic cartoon characters of all time, the spinach-loving, bully-beaten sailor man with a heart of gold, Popeye, and his origin, which means delving into the life of his creator, Max Fleischer. What was the inspiration for Popeye himself? Why did the rights for Popeye switch from Flesicher Studios to Famous Studios? What's Popeye's relevancy today in terms of influencing other animes and his impact? Well, stay tuned to find out on this episode of the Cartoon Curator. The year is 1883. This is a time where the Second Industrial Revolution occurred. During this decade, modern cities and societies were being built from the ground up. 1883 was a special year in particular. For instance, on January 19, 1883, the first electric lighting system implementing overhead wires began in Roselle, New Jersey, installed by Thomas Edison himself. This would be important later in the life of one man who would be born on July of that year, but not in the U.S. Instead, he would be born in Krakow, Poland, to Aaron Fleischer and Amelia Plas. He would come into this world as Max Fleischer, to parents that were hard-working people and one of three siblings. In 1887, his family would migrate to New York City, where his father would use his skills as a tailor to cloth wealthier people. This in turn afforded Max opportunities others didn't have. This unfortunately wouldn't last long because his father would lose the business in 1897. This didn't deter Max though, because he would go on to continue and find his love for art. He received commercial art training at Cooper Union and with the Art Students League of New York, and also attended the Mechanics and Tradesmen School. His love of art would lead him to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, where he began as errand boy and would eventually work his way up the ranks to become a staff cartoonist. From single-panel editorial strips to full ones, he became very renowned. It's from that work he did at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle he would eventually meet John Randolph Bray, an animator who was making waves with his work at the time. He would give Max Fleischer his start in animation. Besides having a passion for drawing and animation, Max was also quite gifted in the art of invention. In 1917, he would go on to create something that would change the world of animation forever. See, back then, animation wasn't like how it is today, obviously. The animation, like the stuff Bray was doing at the time, was very stiff and jerky. Max felt that there was a different approach to fix that. This is why he would go on to create the rotoscope. The rotoscope changed the animation because it allowed the animators to employ film footage and trace over it frame by frame to create realistic movement in the animation. This eliminated the jerkiness instantly. Max, along with his younger brother Dave Fleischer, wanted to employ this technique into something. So they began on an adventure that would create history. The year is 1921. Just as the decade was in full swing, the Fleischer brothers embarked on a new frontier of animation with their patent technique, rotoscoping, and would cement their place in the industry. Coming off their success at Bray Studios with their Out of the Inkwell films, they would leave the studio due to the studio's inability to deliver the films they were contracted to do. Shortly after they left, they would go on to form Inkwell Studios under the Paramount Studios umbrella. Under the Inkwell Studios name, they would go on to create the Song cartoon series, which employed Lee Forrest's newly creation at the time, phonofilm. It was sound embedded on a piece of film. But with these cartoons, the Fleischers would also introduce another innovative feature they would be famously known for: the bouncing ball animation.
They hunt no more for the possum and the pooh.
Basically, a subtitle would appear at the bottom of the screen and a ball would bounce along the words so the audience could sing along with them. This was all in 1924. It wasn't too successful at the time, but it did lay the groundwork for what would emerge next. See, in 1929, the film The Jazz Singer would employ an added new feature to sound on film technology: actual human voice. The Fleischer brothers were inspired by that film's new implementation of sound on film and decided to implement that into their cartoons. With their implementation of voice, Flesicher Studios finally found its first star with Betty Boop in 1930. She would make her debut in the cartoon Dizzy Dishes, which was the 7th installment of their Talkatoon series. Betty Boop originally started out as an anamorphic French poodle, but by 1932, she would be fully realized as a human character in the short Any Rags. Did you know the inspiration for Betty Boop was Clara Bow, who was very popular in the silent film era, even though some will say that she began as a caricature of Helen Kane, who was another famous actress at the time. Betty Boop became a huge success and would establish Flesicher Studios as a contender in the animation industry. But it would be in 1933 where they would introduce a character who would forever change the world of animation. Business had been booming for Flesicher Studios, but as with all those brimming with ambition, Max strived to ante up to keep the ball rolling on things. One day, he would stumble upon a cartoon strip drawn by E.C. Seeger, and they would form a partnership. The comic was called Popeye the Sailor. Well, interestingly, it didn't start out as Popeye. See, for one thing, the comic strip would be published in the King's Features newspaper as Thimble Theater, and it was originally about the adventures of Castor Oil and Ham Gravy in 1919, until Popeye was introduced in the comic strip in 1929. Did you know that the inspiration for the Popeye character actually came from a real-life figure? Yes, he was based off a local man who lived in the same town as E.C. Seeger himself. His name was Frank Rocky Fiegel, a local legend in town. In fact, he was very much like Popeye. How? Well, he usually got into fights, just like Popeye did. He smoked a pipe, just like Popeye did. And even though he didn't eat spinach, or he wasn't a sailor, he did have the most important trait that Popeye had: his kindness towards children. Supposedly, Frank never knew that Popeye was based off of him until the final years of his life. At least on his grave, there's an engraving of Popeye's face on it. Now that's a true homage. The Popeye character became so popular, he would actually replace Ham Gravy as one of the main characters, and the whole comic was eventually structured around Popeye himself. Popeye had become the love interest for Ham Gravy's main squeeze, Castor Oil's sister, Olive. This showed how much the character made an impact with the public. In 1934, the Hays Code impacted the world of animation, and animation that were deemed too mature weren't allowed to prosper, so they had to cater to more of a general audience. Max and Dave Fleischer caught wind of that and decided that the success of Seeger's comic strip would be the perfect cartoon for their post-Hays Code ventures. They would acquire the rights to Popeye from Seeger and King's Features. So in 1933, he would make his first appearance with Betty Boop in Betty Boop Meets Popeye the Sailor. This very cartoon set up all the elements of what would come next. See, this appearance would prove to be so popular, Flesicher Studios gave Popeye his own series of cartoons and carried the elements of that first Betty Boop appearance. like olive oil and Blue's love triangle as knack of spinach. It all started with I Am What I Am in the same year. This cartoon would kickstart his success in the world of animation. This in turn provided them to make cartoons based off Superman, which was another hit for them as well. Popeye was their main product though, and for good reason. Popeye was quite charming. He was a sailor who always fought against the bully. It was a tale of the underdog triumphing against the odds and winning the heart of the woman he adored. And that resonated with the audience at a time of great strife. One of the biggest cartoons to date would be 1937's Popeye the Sailor meets Alibaba's 40 Thieves. Popeye was so popular at one time, he even surpassed Mickey Mouse as the most recognizable cartoon character for a time. This cartoon would employ a very technological advancement in the world of film and animation, Technicolor. Also, this was one of the few cartoons that would be in extra length, lasting 17 minutes, which was quite long for a theatrical cartoon. But despite the success that the Popeye cartoons had, by the 1940s, things would drastically change for our lovable spinach-eating sailor.
Somebody's gonna be sorry for this.
It seemed everything at Flesicher Studios was going well. By the end of the 1930s, a total of 251 Popeye shorts were produced. But by the 1940s, Flesicher Studios had started to come into some financial troubles. In fact, by 1941, Paramount Studios did the unthinkable. They seized Flesicher Studios and ousted the Fleischer brothers in the process. This was due in part of their other projects like Gulliver's Travels costing the studio huge money with its lack of success at the box office. They would take all the assets and form Famous Studios in its place in 1942. This transition would also slowly mark a further change for the character of Popeye. With the advent of Technicolor, Famous Studios adopted more of a cartoony angle, considering now being targeted towards a general audience. Well, not at the beginning of the Famous Studios run, which were in black and white until 1943's Her Honor the Mayor. I will touch on the earlier cartoons towards the end of the episode. Also, the rotoscoping of the older cartoons were long gone. In its place, they adopted traditional animation, considering it was cheaper to do and rotoscoping would be outdated by this point as well. Famous Studios' take on Popeye kept key elements from the Fleischer cartoons, such as it never really deviated from the Bluto, Olive, and Popeye love triangle. In fact, in a majority of the cartoons, this was almost always the focal point of the cartoons. It also reused assets from the original Fleischer cartoons in some of the shorts. The cartoons had lacked the charm the Fleischer cartoons had and were made out of necessity and for the sake of profit. Towards the latter half of the 1950s, animation studios started massively producing cartoons to cater to the television market, and a lot of the film studios started to regulate animation to mostly theatrical features. Famous Studios knew they had to change with the market. In 1955, Famous Studios sold the cartoons to Associated Artists Productions. In other words, these would be distributed to television upon requirement. With Famous Studios ceasing production after 122 cartoons produced, it seemed that Popeye could rest on his laurels in syndication, but new things would come around the corner that would further cement his place in television animation. By the 1960s, the advent of Saturday morning cartoons had flourished on TV, and everybody wanted a piece of the pie, especially King's Features Syndicate. See, even though the Famous Studios cartoons had garnered huge success in TV syndication, King's Features never made a dime off those cartoons. So they decided to throw their hat in the ring and commissioned a made-for-TV Popeye cartoon series. They would give the duties to Al Broadax to serve as the executive producer for these cartoons. This would be a massive collaboration of several animation companies such as Gerald Ray Studios, Jack Kinney Productions, Rembrandt Films, Larry Harmon Productions, and the newly minted Paramount Cartoon Studios. In other words, everybody had their hands in a proverbial cookie jar for this one. Since it was on TV, the animation employed here had to be done cheaply, so they would employ a technique called limited animation. This was a process of creating cartoons that didn't redraw entire frames, but instead reused common parts between frames. This in turn allowed them to pump out more cartoons for the market. But it also affected the quality of the storytelling as well. The cartoons were even more cartoony than Famous Studios and Flesicher Studio's efforts combined. They also kept the look that Popeye had in the original cartoons as well, but the look of Bluto had completely changed. First of all, he went from being a tad muscular to being rotund. Also, his name was changed to Brutus because King's Feature Syndicate thought Paramount had owned the rights to the Bluto name, but that wasn't the case. Despite the mishap, they still went with the name of Brutus. Interestingly, the series actually lifted stories from the E.C. Seeger comic strips rather than the material from the Fleischer and Famous Studios cartoons. Despite the cheaply made animation and limited budget, the series was actually very successful. They had produced a total of 220 cartoons in a span of 2 years. These cartoons would be a staple for a while throughout the 1960s. As the 60s went on, so did the atmosphere of animation. Nothing Popeye related hadn't came out ever since they ceased production on the series. It seemed that Popeye would be a thing of the past, but just like his need to persevere against any obstacle in his path, Popeye would stumble upon a new era to strive.
The spinach, 'cause I eat the spinach.
By the 1970s, theatrical shorts were mostly in short demand and the landscape of animation had changed drastically. First off, besides Disney, most animation studios weren't dabbling in animated shorts, but mostly theatrical features. Instead, TV had become the new pioneer for animation at this point. Several cartoons started to make their mark on television. One such studio that would go on to make a great majority of those cartoons were none other than Hanna-Barbera. We will touch on them in due time. To keep this short, Hanna-Barbera were one of the only studios that had successfully made the transition from theatrical animation to TV animation. In fact, throughout the 70s, they were already dominating airwaves with their cartoons. King's Features Syndicate knew it as well and decided that they would partner with them. They commissioned Popeye's return to TV with the all-new Popeye Hour for CBS in 1978.
Oh, what do you know?
What's going on there?
I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eat the spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
This was a drastic change even from the Famous and Fleischer Studio cartoons and the previous King's Feature Syndicate produced series. Since there was a strict stance on violence in cartoons by this time, Popeye never threw punches like he did in the old cartoons. Instead, he would pick up Bluto and throw him away like a ball. And also, it incorporated PSAs to appease the parents at home. This cartoon would also spin off creations of its own, something that Hanna-Barbera would love doing throughout its tenure on television. The all-new Popeye Hour was a huge success and reintroduced Popeye to a new audience. In between its 5-year run, Popeye would also make his way back to movie theaters after 23 years with a live-action film and a Nintendo game from the creator of Super Mario himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. So to say that Popeye wasn't on a streak would have been a huge understatement. Just as the Saturday morning cartoon boom carried on, so did Popeye. And to capitalize off that, the syndicated cartoons were brought back to television in the late 80s. Also, in 1987, Hanna-Barbera would follow up the success of the all-new Popeye Hour with Popeye and Son. In this iteration, Popeye actually marries Olive Oyl, and they birth a son named Popeye Jr. Funny thing is that, as with any kid growing up, he actually hated spinach. Instead, he liked it hamburgers, just like Wimpy did. Bluto also made his return in the cartoon, and he also had a wife of his own and a son of his own named Tank. And as usual, their rivalry was the basis for most of the cartoon's run, which was quite short. There were only 13 episodes ever produced. In the world of TV animation, when you only get 13 episodes, which is the standard number of episodes for a season, that only means one thing. It wasn't successful. But times were changing, and things would only get dire for our sailor as he treaded new waters.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
As the 90s approached, things were different. The times had become more edgier, and that included animation as well. Unfortunately, Popeye didn't adapt to those times. How could it? You had stuff like Tiny Toon Adventures, Batman Anime Series, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and its various imitators, the emergence of Cartoon Network that would launch in 1992, and Nickelodeon coming to its own around that time as well with their own cartoons dubbed Nicktoons. Let's face it, the animation world had changed a lot since the days of Popeye's inception. Gone were the simple antics and wartime propaganda and simplistic storytelling in favor of cartoons that leaned toward themes, had loads of attitude, complexity with full-on story arcs, and pushed the envelope in terms of characterization and violence. Popeye would be relegated to reruns on cable in the 90s and the like, but he would never make a full-on return. But that didn't matter because Popeye did something that no other cartoon character has ever done since. Popeye captured the hearts of fans for several decades. While a lot of Saturday morning cartoons have faded into obscurity, Popeye had managed to stay in the eyes of the general public. This was due in part of how his legacy was preserved. Case in point, Cartoon Network would actually create the Popeye Show in 2001, which actually restored the Fleischer and Famous Studios cartoons to their original uncut form. Even though there were still a handful of shorts even Cartoon Network didn't touch. Oh yeah, let me touch upon that. See, if you didn't know, all animation back in the earlier years had a lot of racially sensitive material. Unfortunately, Popeye was no different. There were such shorts like Your Sap, Mr. Jap, Scrap the Jap, and See Red, White, and Blue that featured wartime propaganda and Japanese stereotypes. Heck, even his debut, A Betty Boop Meets Popeye the Sailor, it had Popeye and Bluto at a carnival playing a ball toss game where the target was an African American stereotype. Or Popeye a la mode, which featured the same stereotypes as well. Even the short Happy Birthdays sees Popeye commit homicide off screen. I thought I would mention this because, unfortunately, not only this was a part of animation history, but it was a reflection of those times itself. Animators had to cater to the audiences that watched them, and unfortunately, they had to give what the audiences wanted. This fact couldn't be ignored, so I apologize to those I may have offended. As well, a few of those shorts don't reflect what he ultimately was and what he portrayed for future generations. Thank goodness for the Hays Code, right? But with that said, in 2018, Popeye did make a return to the world of animation on YouTube. of all places, with Popeye's Island Adventures, just as we always seen him. Popeye's impact on animation will always be important as it laid down the groundwork not only to a generation of animators to pursue the field, but also redefined what a cartoon character could be. Popeye will forever be a national treasure. He is the symbol of true underdogs everywhere, and also a symbol of a time of days past, good or bad. He's a character who captured our imagination in a time where animation gave us an escape. It gave us a view of the world. In that aspect, Popeye will never become a relic. Elements of those Fleischer and famous era cartoons still carry on in animation today, and in many other forms of media as well, such as the 2017 video game Cuphead, developed by Studio MDHR. Whenever there's a way to watch animation, please believe that Popeye will come across our view. And when the next generation finally finds him again, best believe there will be a can of spinach to open so that he can show us the true meaning of tenacity and bravery. That's why he is, and that's why he will always be.
I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eat space spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
Thank you so much for watching the episode. I just want to say that I just love animation and what it means to all walks of life. Every generation has a means to experience it. So I wanted a way to give back for all the years it inspired me to believe in something and create art. So I made it my mission to curate the animation experience. I hope you appreciate it as well. Speaking of that, if you did, please hit that subscribe button and be a part of the channel. Also, if you liked the episode, please press that like button. I would greatly appreciate it. It shows me that I'm on the right track. Anyway, kids and adults alike, I will see you on the next episode of the Cartoon Curator. Excelsior.